Well, welcome to Sunday School. Hope everybody's doing well. We're going to be looking at the second to last lesson here on Delivered to be Crucified. So we'll be seeing Jesus's ultimate submission to authority, not only the governments, but also ultimately to God's. And one thing I was thinking about, some of you may be aware of, with Martin Luther, he talked about the theology of the cross, which is really seeking after God and his ways, versus the theology of glory, which is self-seeking. So I think we'll see some of that here. And the other thing briefly I want to throw out as a thought is that we can only be submitting to trials, as Christ is doing here, by first submitting to the Lord. And I think we obviously see that in the life of Christ. So just a reminder before praying and get started is that Mark is a fairly short book. So if you're wanting to think about reading that as we're finishing up our study here, it really only takes about an hour and a half to read that. So maybe you might consider doing that. So let's go ahead and pray and we'll get started. Dear God, we thank you for today. We thank you for who you are and how you are in control of all things, and that you are working out your plan in the world. I ask that you be with us as we look at this book of Mark here, specifically in this chapter that looks at the trial and death of your son. Pray that you would be with us during this time, and that you would be using this in the life of your people, and that you would be helping us to grow closer to you, and that we would learn to love you more. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I'm going to go through a number of these outlines again. So just as reminders, and feel free to try to remember any of these that seems the most helpful to you. So remember, there's the first outline, which actually isn't here, but it basically divides the book of Mark up into two, namely splitting them at Peter's confession. So we have what leads up to that confession, and then what happens after that. There is this outline here, which basically looks at things along the lines of geographic terms. So we have the ministry in Galilee, then there is the northern journey, then there is the journey to Jerusalem, followed by the Jerusalem ministry, and then there's the Passion of Christ and his resurrection. This next outline kind of focuses on various items of good news. So there's the beginning of the good news, which all of these outlines kind of have introductory section. Then there is the good news about Jesus's proclamation of the kingdom of God. And then after that, we have the good news about Jesus's teaching on discipleship, which is another main focus. And then towards the end, which is where we're in today, which is the good news about Jesus's death. And then as a conclusion, we have the good news about the empty tomb. And this is the outline that I had kind of come up with, which focuses on three main things. We have Jesus's ministry, which has two parts, the main years of ministry and then the ministry in Jerusalem. And then we have Jesus's sacrifice, which is the section that we're in. And then at the end, we have Jesus's resurrection as well. Okay, so for what we have in our section today, in the first 5 verses, we have Jesus before Pilate. And then after that, we have in 6 through 15, we have the substitute. And then in 16 through 20, we have the mocked king. And then in 21 through 41, we have the crucifixion of Christ. I will go ahead and read this section, and then we will look at it more closely. Early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders and scribes and the whole council, immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered, "It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him again, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many things they are bringing against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release to them any one prisoner whom they requested. The man named Barabbas had been in prison with the insurrectionist who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering again, Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with him whom you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." But Pilate said to them, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers took him away into the palace, that is, the Praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating his head with a reed and spitting on him, and kneeling and bowing before him. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him and put his own garments on him, and they led him out to crucify him. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Then they brought him to the place Golgotha, which is translated place of the skull. They tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him, and dividing up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, "And he was numbered with transgressors." Those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads, and saying, "Ha, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes, were mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him were also insulting him. When the 6th hour came, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, "Behold, he is calling for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him a drink, saying, "Let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." There were also some women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they used to follow him and minister to him. And there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Okay, so as we begin here, one thing to note is that Mark really is focusing on the what in his gospel and doesn't get a whole lot into the why. And so we're going to really see that here today as we see what leads up to the death of Christ, is that he's not really explaining things, he's just telling what has happened. So as we come to these first verses here, we're looking at Jesus before Pilate. And so what we have at the beginning is a little bit of setting information. And so we have a time marker, and there's actually 4 in this chapter. We have the one here, there's one in verse 25, one in verse 33, and then another in the section next week in verse 42. So notice that it says at the beginning that this is happening early in the morning. This word is at once or immediately. And so the Jews are moving quickly here. We have the chief priests are one of this group. And interestingly, they actually appear more frequently toward the end of all the Gospels than elsewhere. And so they have a big part to play here. We also have the scribes, who are experts and specialists in the law of Moses. And then it says that they are calling together the whole council. And so this is the high council in Jerusalem. And so this is probably the Sanhedrin. One of the things that I was looking at described this and said that this body was the ultimate authority, not only in religious matters, but in legal and governmental affairs as well, insofar as it did not encroach on the authority of the Roman procurator. The latter, so the Roman procurator, for example, had to confirm death sentences passed by the council. And so that's where we have the interaction with Pilate here. It says that they had bound Jesus. So possibly this is to make it appear as if Jesus is some sort of dangerous criminal. And then it says that they led him away. And to lead away here actually means to lead away kind of in constraint, so under bonds, as it says earlier. Note that it doesn't say anything here about any sort of decision being made, so that's an interesting point. And then we have the other main participant here is Pilate, and he is only mentioned in this chapter here as far as Mark is concerned, and he may have been in Jerusalem kind of in order to keep things calm during the Passover. Okay, so moving into verse 2, it says that Pilate is beginning to question Jesus, and this word here can be used of a judge questioning, kind of making an investigation, and so Pilate's doing his job here, and this will actually also be used farther down in verse 4. And this question that Pilate asks here is actually mentioned in all 4 of the Gospels. So that kind of shows that that's important and is kind of a key element here. Which is the question, are you the king of the Jews? This title here is probably used of the Messianic king, but it wasn't part of the questioning that we had in the previous chapter that the Jews were doing. Their question culminated in what they were asking is, are you the Christ? And so I think I kind of agree what this one commentary said. King of the Jews is therefore a Christological title, emphasizing Jesus's authority and greatness. And so there's not a whole lot of difference, seemingly, between King of the Jews and Christ, although I don't know how much knowledge Pilate would have of that per se. One thing with this title, King of the Jews, remember back at Jesus's birth, this was a big concern for Herod, that he had heard that someone had been born King of the Jews, and that was a threat to him. And so here, this also comes up at the end of Christ's life as well. So Pilate is really only going to be concerned here about political charges, and so he's not going to really care if the Jews bring up any religious issues. But he is asking this question about King of the Jews, which would be kind of more related to his domain. Then we get to Christ's response here in verse 2, which is what he says, "It is as you say." So it's more literally, and you may notice the italics, but more literally, it is just "you have said" or "you say." And so this is seemingly something that doesn't match, right? It doesn't seem to be a direct response to what Pilate has said. And so how do we determine what the meaning of that is? So first, I think as this is not an explicit denial, I think that means that it is an implicit assent to being king of the Jews. Kind of in conversations, we're trying to be helpful when somebody asks questions. And so I think if that was not the case, Jesus would have provided that type of information. Also, in the way that he's saying this, in that he says, "You say that I'm king of the Jews." I think that's also in the situation an appeal to Pilate's authority, and saying that, you're the one who's saying this. If you're speaking truth, then you must think that is the case. And also potentially a implicit submission to Pilate's authority in this situation. One interesting thing here to note is that Jesus doesn't directly reveal who he is to very many people. Obviously, he does that to the disciples. He did that to the woman at the well in John, the Gospel of John. But in some sense, he's doing that to Pilate here as well. He is, acknowledging that he is the King of the Jews, and that there's an important element in that. Then moving into verse 3, we see the chief priests come in again. I mean, I think the focus is still mainly here on Pilate, but I think the chief priests aren't really giving up on attacking Jesus as they can. So they are accusing him. They are bringing charges against him kind of in this court setting. This isn't the first time they've been seeking to accuse Jesus. Back in chapter 3, when there was kind of a series of things related to the Sabbath, they were also looking for reasons to accuse him. And so they are doing that here as well. And some of these charges are actually kind of similar to what we have brought against Paul when some of that gets stirred up in Jerusalem as well. It says that they are bringing many accusations, and yet in the previous chapter, they weren't really able to even get two witnesses to agree. So that's kind of curious that they apparently have so many, and yet none of those were sticking, and none of them were enough to accuse him other than Christ acknowledging that he was the Christ. It says that they are accusing him harshly. You may have a note on this. It's more literally of many things. So they're accusing him of many things. And yet, none of those had been able to produce anything, as we saw in the last chapter. Okay, getting to verse 4, we have Pilate asking Jesus a second question. And Pilate has really been surprised at how Jesus is responding to the situation. And so now he's going to kind of question Jesus about his behavior because Jesus isn't really doing what he expected. So he asks him, "Do you not answer?" And so this kind of seems to be at this point really a little bit of a turning point in Jesus's interaction with Pilate, because from this time he doesn't say anything. More literally, what we have here in verse 5 is, but Jesus no longer nothing answered. And so I think that's really kind of emphasizing that he is not saying anything to Pilate from this point on. So there comes to be a time for silence. And I think that's also where we see Jesus's reliance on God. And so this is kind of emphasizing this silence in this trial that he is going through. We do see here also in verse 5 that this is something that had an effect on Pilate. It says that he was amazed, and so this is to be very impressed or disturbed by something. And maybe for Pilate's case, it was both. Pilate, the same word will be used to Pilate later in this chapter, not this lesson, but the next lesson when he learns that Jesus had already died. That was also something that was amazing to him as well. So in what we see here, notice that we don't have Pilate actually condemning Jesus of anything. And so what we get from that really is that Pilate and Rome, right, because Pilate is kind of representing Rome, they don't find any cause to condemn Jesus of anything. And so that really is, although it's more implicit, it is a declaration of Jesus's innocence, despite really what Pilate allows to happen next. Calvin, in his commentary, said Christ, by his silence, allowed his innocence to be suspected. And that doesn't really take away from the actual innocence. It's just putting ideas potentially in others' minds, but that doesn't actually change the actual state of affairs. In Isaiah 53:7, we have something that speaks of this. It says, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth." And so seeing how Jesus responds and acts in regard to things here should be something that we consider for ourselves as well. How well do we deal with oppression? Are we opening our mouths when similar things come our way? Okay, so moving into the next verses, we go into the next section, which is really dealing with the substitute. And so looking in verses 6 and 7, we kind of have a little bit of an interlude here with some additional information provided to us. So first we have some background information about a custom, and this is something where a prisoner would be released. This word for released is a legal term to grant acquittal. And what's interesting, if you think about it, is like, what kind of justice is this? That somebody who has been condemned and sentenced is able to be released. And so we should be thinking about comparing that with God's justice and how he does things. And really what we're going to be seeing here with Jesus and how that God in his justice is punishing sin through the sacrifice of his perfect son. So in this custom, though, the people, it says, were able to specify the prisoner that they wanted released. And so that kind of goes into the next verse where we are introduced to more background information about a person here. And this is Barabbas. Now, there is a manuscript difference in Matthew's account of this that actually says that the full name is Jesus Barabbas. And Origen, one of the early church fathers, also has that as well. So that is a possibility. And that might be some of the reasons for some of the questions that Pilate asks, is that there may actually have been confusion about which Jesus the crowd or the scribes and Pharisees, or scribes and chief priests were talking about. So what we learn about Barabbas is that he was one of the insurrectionists. This word's only used here, and it actually means fellow insurrectionists. So there were other people along with him. And it says that he had been imprisoned, so he had been bound just like Jesus. So there's some similarity here between Barabbas and Jesus. So in verses 8 through 10, we return to the narrative. And so previously we had the leaders taking action. Here we have the crowd taking action. So they had remembered this custom, and they were counting on having it happen this year as well. So they come asking Pilate. And so as they're asking, they feel like they have some, claim on getting an answer back, and presumably a favorable one. So in verse 9, we really have what's said here, referring back to what we had described about some of this background setting stuff in verse 6. So, but notice there's a difference. So in verse 6, we're told that the custom specified that the people were the one who got to make the choice. And so here, Pilate is actually violating this convention, as he is suggesting a prisoner to release. And so perhaps this in part leads to the negative response that is received, and this could actually here be seen as the start of all the problems that Pilate causes for himself. So in asking the people, or responding to them as they have asked for this custom to be upheld, Pilate says, "Do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" So Pilate had already asked Jesus if he was the King of the Jews, and so his acknowledging that here may be something that, looking back to Jesus's somewhat cryptic reply may actually tell us how Pilate understood that. So in Jesus confirming that, then Pilate kind of continues using that expression about him. Alternately, or I mean, it doesn't necessarily negate that either. Pilate could actually be using this ironically or in a sarcastic or mocking way to the Jews, because I think we can see some tension between Pilate and the Jews in this. So Pilate himself, he may have been trying to release Jesus out of spite, to spite the Jews, but what happens really is it just kind of aggravates the situation. So we have another piece of information provided for us in verse 10. This is about the chief priests. And I think this might help explain Pilate's actions in verse 9. Pilate is responding this way to the Jews because he knew of their envy. So they're doing this out of envy. And so he is sort of provoking them in how he responds to them. Okay, and going into verse 11, we have the chief priests again taking some action here, and perhaps they are doing this because they have not to this point been able to get Pilate to do what they were hoping for, and so now they take other action to see if they can get the results that they want. So Pilate, on his side, if he had been hoping that he would induce the people to ask for Jesus, we see that his plan actually backfires here. It says that the chief priests stir up the crowd. The same word here, which can mean to disturb, upset, incite, is actually the accusation that the chief priests bring against Jesus in Luke 23. And so that's kind of interesting that they themselves are doing the same thing here. And their purpose in this, we can see that by the word "to" at the end here, is that they are wanting to have Barabbas released. Okay, continuing along, kind of in the same section on this substitute of Barabbas, we can see that the situation is starting to close in on Pilate. And so it says that he answers them again. And so this is the second answer. The first one was he asked them, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" And then here he's asking about what to do with Jesus. So since he had kind of messed things up by suggesting an alternate, like he suggested the prisoner to release, not the people, now he has to deal with what to do with the rejected prisoner that he suggested. And it's kind of this bizarre situation because why is he asking the people's advice? He is the one who is in authority. So we have King of the Jews used again. And it's interesting to think about why Pilate says that they call Jesus King of the Jews. So is he just saying that the general populace is thinking that Jesus is the King of the Jews, or is he again mocking them at this point? If we look into verse 13, we can see that we have kind of moved beyond the courtroom and doing things in any sort of legal way. They're not really concerned about justice now. And it says that they are shouting back to Pilate. And this word "back" is actually the word "again." And so if that is the way it should be interpreted, we have to ask, where is the first occurrence of this? And if they're shouting again, we have to find out the first place that they were shouting. And so perhaps that is when they were crying out for Barabbas. So again, could be referring to the shouting and not to the contents of what they're shouting. So this may not be the second time they're shouting "crucify," but it could just be the second time they're shouting, period. But what we do see here is they are asking or shouting, demanding that Christ be crucified. So again, as we kind of have this bizarre situation, what we have is the subjected Jewish people who are actually, in this instance, commanding Rome what to do. In this, I think we see a little bit of duplicity. So the Jews hated Rome, So why would they deliver one of their own uh, people over to Rome? So that's kind of the first question, and why they even brought Jesus to Pilate. But then the second question, which is relating to Jesus and Barabbas, is they had just charged Jesus with rebellion against Rome. That kind of would be the only thing that would kind of stick and matter to Pilate. So if that's the case, why would they want Barabbas released, who had done essentially the same thing that they are accusing Jesus of? So that's a little bit inconsistent on the part of the people. Okay, moving into verse 14, we have Pilate, who, having kind of opened the door to letting the crowd decide the way things are going to go, he's here trying to close the door and kind of bring things back into a courtroom setting, but it's not going to work for him. So he brings up the question about what evil has Jesus done. And so an evil thing would be referring to something that is socially or morally reprehensible. And note that this is given in context of crucifixion, meaning that crucifixion needed to be done for a reason, and not just because like you didn't like somebody or you were envious of them, as in their case. And so there needed to be a reason behind this. But we see that that doesn't get anywhere. And it says that they shouted all the more. And so this is an increase over what they had done before. So they were shouting, "Crucify him," before, but they are doing that even more now. So once the crowd had been given their head, really there's no turning back. And notice that even in this, the crowd is not giving any sort of accusation against Jesus. They're just saying, "Crucify him." There's no reason for this. Okay, moving into verse 15, Pilate has essentially lost control of the crowd at this point, so he essentially has to give in. So we see Pilate's failure here, and his problem really was trying to maintain control over this custom that had been established, really led to this getting out of hand here. So we have an inversion of the natural order. We have the people essentially trying to command the government. So what we have is it says that Pilate was wishing to satisfy the crowd. So this is to do someone a favor or grant a request. And what he does in this is that he takes two actions. One is to release Barabbas, which is what they were asking for. And nothing actually said that he couldn't release more than one person. But then what he does with Jesus is he says that he has him scourged and then has him handed over to be crucified. So scourging is flogging, and looking in a Greek dictionary, it said this is a punishment inflicted on slaves and provincials after a sentence of death has been pronounced on them. Also performed after sentence to animal combat. And so I think it's interesting to think here what we have is Jesus as a representative substitute for a representative sinner. So Barabbas is kind of this representative person who has done bad. He's an insurrectionist, so he's a rebelling against authority, which ultimately is what we have done as sinners, as rebel against God's authority. And what we have is Jesus being a substitute for that individual. So Jesus is essentially dying as an insurrectionist, and that is what is needed to solve the problem with human rebellion against God. Okay, moving into 16 through 20, we have the mocked king here. And this isn't the only place that Jesus is mocked, but this is the mocking that is done by the soldiers. And really what we have here is kind of a dehumanizing of Jesus. And so this is really adding additional things that are worse onto the sentence of death that he has received. It seems like this might actually be kind of a standard game that the Romans played. They would kind of make a mock king of somebody, only then to kill them. And so this is kind of a very cruel thing that they are doing here. Just a reminder from the previous chapter that Jesus was also mocked at his Jewish trial. So you can see that in 14 verse 65. And in what we're seeing here, we can really see that all that was done to Christ is kind of a little bit of a reflection of what we ourselves actually deserve. So in the following verses, details are provided of the summary of the previous verse, so back in verse 15. And then which was after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. And then this verse here, the first one, verse 16, is showing the preparation in that. So it says that they took him away, so they lead him away as a prisoner or a condemned man, and they take him to, it says the palace, which its primary meaning is courtyard, but here it is palace because we have the word praetorium mentioned here as well. In this, it also mentions the Roman cohort. Cohort is a 10th part of a legion, and so that's around 600 men, but that could vary as well. And it says that they are dressing him up in purple, and this is also used in Luke 16:19. And really, this is being done as a mocking representation of royalty. And we'll see a number of similar things here. So purple cloth was dyed from a shellfish, and so that's how they got this, and I imagine that was a tedious process. The other thing that they are doing here is putting a crown together. So a crown, a normal crown, is a wreath made of foliage or designed to resemble foliage and worn by one of high status or held in high regard. And so that is something that's being done in mockery here, because what they're doing is not what the normal thing would mean, but they are making that into a joke, essentially. The word crown can also have a figurative usage, which is to an award or prize for exceptional service or conduct. And so both of these are really being made a mockery and irony here. So not only are they trying to make Jesus look externally like a king, but they are doing and joining in with their words as well, and doing this in a mocking way too. So it says that they are acclaiming him, Hail King of the Jews. And to acclaim is to engage in hospitable recognition. So the hospitable part is obviously not happening here. And it's done of homage to a king. And so that's kind of the part that comes into play here. And so they're doing this as ironic. The word hail here is kind of a more formalized greeting, wishing somebody well. Here it's actually in command form, and this is actually an imitation of what was done for Caesar. So the greeting for that would be Hail Caesar the Emperor. And so here they're saying Hail King of the Jews, and again, being done in a mocking way. Now, if there had been any illusion that this was not mockery, this is kind of destroyed when we get to verse 19. And we can see that this has just been cruelty, because they actually start kind of in an unveiled way showing this and what they do. And so they begin to beat him on his head with a reed. And so they are dishonoring his head, but also in the fact that they use a reed, which is kind of a sign of weakness, instead of a scepter, right? So there's kind of this mocking scepter that they have. And a scepter would be a sign of strength, and yet they're using a reed instead. Says that they are also spitting on him, so that would also be another degradation. And it says that they are kneeling, so that would be to show deference, and also bowing, which is showing really somebody's dependence or submission to an authority, and yet they're not really doing that. And so they keep up this pantomime really until they are done. And by their actions, they're really showing what they truly thought of Jesus, which is that they too thought that he was worthy of death. And so what we have then is switching from a description of this mocking to what they do next. So they were holding him in derision, but then it says that they are going to lead him off to crucify him. So their purpose now is to crucify. Okay, so as we move to the next verse, we come into the last section, which is the crucifixion of Christ. And as we are going there, we get some kind of introductory things first. And the first thing is that the soldiers need to get somebody to help with the cross. And so it says that they press somebody into service. So they are compelling somebody to do this. And the reason why would seemingly be that Jesus was unable to do that himself, just from all that he had been through to this point. So this is kind of similar or related to one thing that Jesus brings up in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:41. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And so that is something that somebody is having to do for Jesus here. And we get some information about where this person is coming from. And so it's coming from the country. And then we see who it is, which is Simon, and where he's from. It says of Cyrene, which is the capital city of the North African district of Cyrenaica. And it's actually also mentioned in Acts 2. There's people from the parts of Libya near Cyrene on the day of Pentecost. One interesting thing here is it have some kind of parenthetical information about that he is the father of Alexander and Rufus. And so this would seem to possibly indicate that these two individuals are known to whoever Mark was writing to. Now, there is a Rufus mentioned in Romans 16 at the closing greeting there. And so that's kind of helping to further clarify who this Simon is. And so if Mark was written to those in Rome, just as the letter of Romans was, then that could kind of tie in here. So we see the purpose of the soldiers pressing Simon into service was so that he could bear the cross for Christ. So in verses 22 through 24, we see what was done. And Mark describes what happened and not the significance. So we kind of continue to see that happening here. So these next verses, so 22 through 23, deal with the preparation for the crucifixion. So it mentions that they are bringing him to Golgotha. And this is only mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and John's account. This is actually from an Aramaic word, which Mark is going to translate for us, just as he does some other translation for us later. So the translation is that this is the place of the skull. And if you have a King James, I think you may have Calvary here, which is actually not Greek or a translation, but is actually Latin for skull. And so that's where that came in. Then it says that in verse 23, they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh. And so it's very unclear about who this they is. Does that relate back to the soldiers? Does that relate to some other name group? I think there's some who believe that this might be some of the women of Jerusalem that are doing this. And this wine mixed with myrrh is only mentioned here. And it's possible that this was something that the soldiers are doing to actually make the crucifixion easier on them, as opposed to any intent to try and make this easier on the victim. We also should try to remember that wine is often used as a symbol of God's wrath. And so Jesus is not accepting that from humans, and Jesus didn't turn away from any of the pain that was going to be coming. Christ had actually settled in Gethsemane that he would drink the whole cup of God's wrath undiluted. And so in John 18:11, he says to Peter, "Put the sword into the sheath, the cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" And so that is what he is doing. So then we get to something that happens after Jesus is on the cross, and that is the dividing of his clothing. So that's being distributed to various persons here, potentially the soldiers that were tasked with his execution. And it says that they are distributing them by lot. And so these lots could be some sort of marked objects, stones, sticks, pieces of pottery, and they're being used to decide something. It's interesting here, I got to thinking about, so we have Christ being compared a little bit to Barabbas, but I think it's possible also that we could have a relation between Christ and Adam here. So Adam, when he sinned, was naked, and clothing only came afterwards. And so Christ here, having his clothing taken from him, could be kind of looking back to Adam and the fall, potentially. Moving into 25 through 28, we have some more pieces of the setting here, kind of about the scene. So we have the time given. And so the hours here are really mentioned from the beginning of the day, which is 6 a.m. And so the third hour would be 9 then. And this is a time that's provided for a crucial part of what is happening here. So we can see that the chief priests had moved quickly in order to get this accomplished, because that's not a whole lot of time to get something done in 3 hours like that. So notice also that there's kind of just this very simple statement. It was the third hour when they crucified him. So not a lot of frills in that statement, and it's very to the point for really something that's very important and significant. One interesting thing I found in my studies was that we get our word excruciating from the Latin word for cross. And so that's something we have. Then in verse 26, it goes on to the inscription, which is normally something that was carved into something, but it came to be used for notices on other materials as well. And so we have the charge here, which should be the basis for legal action. And this is the only charge that we kind of hear about, which is that he is the King of the Jews, which is kind of similar to him being called Christ, which isn't really a crime. We also get more of the scene here in that he is crucified between two robbers. These are highwaymen or bandits of some type, and that is who is with Christ as he is dying. So also notice here that Christ is central even in death. He's between these two robbers. And it's interesting to think about how far that Christ lowered himself. Like, it was a huge lowering of himself to become man. But now he has been mistreated and abused, and now he is going to be dying in this way that was really put together to bring shame. And so this is essentially the lowest of points that we have. The part about the robbers on his right and on his left made me think about James and John and their request to be on Jesus's right and left. And so there's a little bit of a contrast there. From Isaiah, we have this that relates to what we have here. Isaiah 53:12, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out his life to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sins of many and interceded for the transgressors. So we see that even this really is part of God's plan, as that had been prophesied. And we see the part here, which is in brackets, meaning it's not in some of the manuscripts, but that scripture was fulfilled by this. So this is bringing something to a designed end, and is used of divine predictions or promises that are fulfilled. And it's actually passive here, meaning that God is the one that is bringing that to pass. So the transgressors that are mentioned here are those who would be violating moral standards and are lawless. So I thought briefly I'd interject this here because I think it's helpful, since Psalm 22 is kind of in a fair amount of the background here, just to briefly point out some of the things that relate to what we're seeing here. Obviously, there's probably more that you could pull out as well. But Christ was forsaken, and that's part of that's the cry that he utters from the cross. We've seen mocking. There will be more mocking coming. There is physical affliction, so it talks about some of the things that are happening to his body. His heart's like wax, etc. We have the parceling out of his clothes, which we've just seen. But then also later in the psalm, it talks about telling his brethren about the name of the Lord. And so I think that's an important part of this as well, and a potentially thing that is looking forward to the resurrection. Okay, so as we continue, we're kind of back to the narrative as we're looking at verses 29 and 30. And some of this here relating to the mocking that's going to happen made me think of Psalm 22:8. So commit yourself to the Lord, let him deliver him, let him rescue him because he delights in him. So in Psalm 22, this is part of the mocking that is against the psalmist, and that is what we see here. It says that they are hurling abuse. So this is to speak in a disrespectful way, meaning to demean somebody, to malign them. So that's what it means in relation to humans. But if this is done in relation to God, it means to slander, or revile, or defame. And so really they're being very, irreverent and disrespectful in what they are doing here. They bring up something that Christ had said about destroying the temple, and they bring that up to mock him. And it's almost surprising that they actually remember this. So it shows that they were listening, but that didn't bring them any profit. And so Christ here is even being misunderstood in his death. So one thing that's interesting is these people who are passing by actually command him to save himself. So this is actually command form, but they're really using this as a taunt. So they, from their perspective, would see him only as a human, and so therefore he doesn't actually have the ability to save himself. And so this is something that they are taunting with him with. One of the commentaries I was reading said, ironically, if Jesus had come down from the cross, he could not have saved either himself or others. And so that's an important thing to remember. There is a purpose of God that is being accomplished here that obviously these people aren't understanding. Moving into verses 31 through 32, notice it says in the same way. So we're being introduced to another group of mockers, and that is the chief priests. And this is actually the last mention of them. And it's interesting to think that they here, the chief priests, are present at this great sacrifice that God is providing. It says that they are mocking. The others were said to be abusing him, but it's all kind of the same thing. And this is the second use of mocking. We have that with the soldiers. We also have the scribes here as well, joining in. And what they are bringing forward is that they say that he saved others and he cannot save himself. So he doesn't have the capacity to do this. And so they're bringing this forward as a weakness. Notice that they as well are bringing forward the notion that Jesus should save himself. And so that's interesting that both groups bring that up, not realizing that the work of salvation that Jesus was accomplishing was for others and not for himself. And so it's kind of interesting that that's happening. One of the commentaries I was reading said, precisely because he refused to save himself, he was able to save others. And so that's something that the crowds and the chief priests don't understand. So we have the Lord concerned for others even in his death. As he's doing this, he's not seeking to save himself, but others. And Christ, they bring up, let this Christ, the King of Israel, was looked on. So the Christ for the Israelites was the fulfiller of the expectations of a deliverer. And here they actually have their deliverer on the cross, but like he's still actually working deliverance despite what they're doing. They also mention him as the King of Israel. Again, they're doing this in a mocking way. But notice how Christ and King of Israel are used in the same sentence, kind of in parallel. And so this is kind of getting back to what we had earlier in the chapter, kind of wondering if King of the Jews being used by Pilate and others is actually more of a reference to Christ. We have a difference here in that it's not King of the Jews, but King of Israel. And so the Jews wouldn't speak of themselves as Jews, but they'd refer to the King of Israel. They are commanding him to come down. So that's kind of similar to what we had before, or exactly similar. It's the same words. And they're seeking a sign here so that they would see and believe. And we know from Hebrews 11 that that's not the way faith works. Faith does not need to see things to believe. So believe would be to consider something true or to consider somebody trustworthy, and that's not what they are doing here. Calvin, in his commentary, said, "Let us allow God to conceal his power whenever it pleases him to do so, that he may afterward display it at his pleasure at the proper time and place." And so really they're asking Christ to do something out of place or not at the correct time, the time that God has appointed. And so that's obviously not going to be happening. And then we have the last group mocking here, which is those who are crucified with him. It says that they are insulting. And so they are seeking to find fault or demean him in this. Okay, as we continue to verse 33, we have another time marker, which is the 6th hour. And it says that darkness came for 3 hours. And so I was thinking about this. There's a couple interesting things on this. I was wondering if this might be a marker of the, like a symbolic withdrawal of the Father from Christ. The other thing is that this darkness probably should make us, especially at the time of Passover, think back to the Exodus, and the 9th plague right before the Passover was the plague of darkness, and the plague of darkness also had a 3 associated with it. There it was 3 days of darkness, and here we have 3 hours. With this darkness, there are some who try to find a natural cause for this, but at the time of Passover, that is a full moon, and for a full moon, the sun has to be opposite the moon and shining fully on it, which means that that is not a time that you can have a solar eclipse, because a solar eclipse is when a new moon crosses in front of the sun. And then notice at the end of this verse here, it says, came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And so this word until actually tells us that there's going to be something important happening when we get to the 9th hour, which is what we see in the next verse. So what we have in verse 34 is actually the only saying from the cross that Mark provides for us. It's actually the same one that Matthew provides, and then the other Gospels give us the other 6 for the full 7. And it says that Jesus is crying out. And this word cry is actually meaning to use one's voice at high volume. And it's used in pleading petitions or in anguished outcries. And I think we see the latter here. This is also the same word that is used back in chapter 1, verse 3, where Isaiah is quoted about John the Baptist crying in the wilderness. So what we have here is Jesus saying some things in Aramaic. So all this is in Aramaic. So Eloi is Aramaic for my God, and Lama is Aramaic for why. And then Sabachthani is Aramaic for you have forsaken me. And so to forsake is to separate connection with someone, to forsake, abandon, desert. And so because Jesus is saying that here, we kind of have to ask, when did the Father forsake the Son? So if he's making this statement, does that mean it happened previously? Does that mean it's happening and starting now and continuing into the future? And so it's interesting to think about what that might mean. It does, at least from the translation, sound like, why have you forsaken me? Meaning it has happened in the past. So maybe that corresponds with when the darkness came, or yeah, who knows? So, but what we have here is this quote from Psalm 22. And so this quoting of this would probably bring the rest of the psalm to mind. And this psalm is a psalm of trust in God. It does say, my God. It's not saying God, why have you forsaken me? But it is saying my God, meaning there is still a connection to God. This is not a unusual thing in the Psalms. There's a number of Psalms that talk about distance from God. So Psalm 10:1 says, "Why do you stand afar off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" Or Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face?" And so really Psalm 22 is along those same lines in indicating uh, that type of feeling. And so sometimes our experience seems to contradict the word of God. Now, Jesus is in a different situation than we are. We as sinners naturally experience, like probably all our life, a certain separation from God just because of sin. Now, Jesus would not have had that experience being the perfect, sinless Son of God. But what we have at this point is we have the sins of those that God is redeeming placed on Christ. And so he is feeling that separation that sin causes and bearing that not just for one person, which is all that we've ever experienced, but he's actually bearing this for many people. And so that is what he is feeling at this point. So hearing this, we have the bystanders thinking that he is calling for Elijah. And some of the things that I was reading, the thought was that Elijah would be the one who would rescue the righteous. And so they are thinking that Elijah would come if Jesus is the righteous person to rescue him. Then we have in verse 36, them coming to give him a drink. And there's a number of things happening there. So running, filling a sponge, putting it on a reed, and then getting that up to him to drink. And so we have this reed mentioned again, which was what he was beat with. And so it's unclear what they're hoping to do, if they're trying to revive him. People probably knew that somebody didn't, generally die after only 6 hours of crucifixion. So it's not clear if they're trying to help him to be able to speak easier or something along those lines potentially. But what happens in verse 37 is different from what they're expecting. And so instead, what we have here is Jesus uttering a loud cry. And this is normally something that wasn't possible for people being crucified there. The nature of what they're going through and the nature of how they're on the cross just kind of made that very difficult. And it's possible that what was said here is his cry, "It is finished." And then it says that he breathed his last. And so these people thought that maybe Elijah was going to be coming, but Jesus very quickly dies after this. So one of the commentaries I was looking at said that death rarely ensued before 36 hours had elapsed. And so here, after only 6, we have Jesus dying. And it may seem like this is a defeat, but it is not. Reading some of Pastor L.D. Custis's sermon notes, he said he died knowing completely what he was doing. And so we have to remember that Jesus is being submissive to the will of God and doing what God has planned. And so he's doing that even here. So we don't have Mark giving any of the significance of these things, but if we think back to Mark 10:45, Jesus said, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And so this is the ransom being offered here. Also in Mark's account of the Lord's Supper for the cup, it said, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." And so here, Jesus is pouring out his blood for the many. Then in verse 38, we have a result provided for us, which is that the veil of the temple was torn. And so this is probably the inner curtain, and all the synoptics actually mention this. And the word torn here is actually to divide something by force, but it's actually passive, meaning something else is doing the action. And I think that obviously would be God here, but it's not something that any human saw other than the results of that. And so at this point, the way to the Holy of Holies was opened at Christ's death. And this had to be done after the sacrifice was complete. And so the way to God can't be made open until the sacrifice is complete and accepted. Again, Pastor Custis in a sermon note said, for the first time in history, the way was opened into the holiest of all. Then we have another thing here at the end, which is this centurion. And this word centurion is actually only in Mark 3 times in this chapter and nowhere else. But the thing that he noticed was the way or the manner in which Jesus died. And that was striking, that was different, that was not something that he had seen. This is probably somebody who had seen death a number of times. But what's interesting is to notice the conclusion that he draws from this difference that he saw. So first, notice that he said that truly this man was, and so this is in the past tense. So this man is no more from his point of view, and so he's confirming that Christ actually died. But he says that this was the Son of God. And so Son of God is something that was mentioned way back in the first verse of Mark. And so I think that draws us back to there, being one of the purposes that Mark had in writing his gospel. It's also mentioned a number of other times in Mark as well. Calvin says, so then, in order to prove himself to be the Son of God, it was necessary that he should hang on the cross. And so he has done this, and even in his death is showing himself to be the Son of God. Now, it's possible that the centurion here is the first to believe and be saved after Christ's death. And it's interesting to think about what is Mark's purpose in including this thing about the centurion. If this was not a true confession, would Mark actually include that? And so I think because it is a true confession of who Jesus is, that's a possible reason that this might be somebody who's actually saved. Okay, now we get to the last 2 verses here, which are about these women who were also there and also witnesses. So we see who, and they are mentioned kind of as witnesses because the disciples weren't there, so witnesses needed to be there for this event, which is obviously very important. So we have these women who are actually proving to be stronger than the disciples at this point. The 12 are scattered, but not all the disciples, because a number of the disciples, as we see, were women. Now it says that they were looking on from a distance, and so they are observing this really with sustained attention, and they are really paying attention to what is going on. But we do have this other qualification: they are doing this from a distance, and so we're not told the reason. Maybe it's they didn't want to see the details. Maybe they needed to be that far away. Who knows? And then we have some of the individuals mentioned. So we have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less and Joseph, and then also Salome. And it's possible that not Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, it's possible that that might be the mother of Jesus. Some think that it's indicated in an odd way as far as mentioning James the Less and Joseph, meaning that that might make it not the mother of Jesus. But one thing that was interesting, if you look back to Mark 6:3, it says about Jesus, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And so obviously we know from other places that Jesus's mother's name was Mary, and it mentions 2 of the brothers' names in the same order here as it did in chapter 6, verse 3. And so that's a possibility there. And if it is Jesus, or if this is Mary, the mother of Jesus, notice that she's mentioned in the middle of the 3 women that are mentioned here. And so that's kind of putting that in a special place. Salome is potentially the wife of Zebedee and the mother of James and John. And you can look at Matthew 27:56. And then we see what these women were doing. Not only were they at the cross, but in verse 41, we can see that they were following Jesus in his ministry. And so they're following him as one who leads, and therefore following is actually something that's used a lot in relation to disciples. And so I think they were following and learning with the disciples as well. The other thing is it says that they were ministering, so they are performing duties, rendering assistance, serving, and they are helping kind of support Jesus as he is going around teaching. And then also in 41, and it says, and there were many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. And women as a word doesn't actually occur in this verse, but it does say other, and that word other is feminine and plural, and so it's actually justified to say other women. And so Jesus, as we know in his ministry, is just attracting people to him because of his teaching, because of his healings that he's doing wherever he goes. And so people are drawn to him. And so here we have some of those women that were drawn and following after him and learning from him in his ministry. Okay. Just in summary, here are some of the things that kind of stood out to me and I was thinking about. So Jesus's silence really is indicators of his reliance on God during this great difficulty that he went through. We also see Jesus as a substitute for rebels against God. So some of that is what we see in Jesus being given over to be crucified instead of Barabbas. We see many mocking God's son, even though he came to save. And so we see that here. Also, we see that salvation doesn't come in the way that we think it will. And so us and our humanness would obviously do things way different than what God knows needs to be done to actually solve the problem that we have created. We see that Jesus was forsaken of God so that we would be accepted. And so we see his call out, why have you forsaken me, my God? And we see from kind of the testimony of the centurion that the manner of Jesus's death was unexpected. So we have his loud cry being unexpected and his quick death after only 6 hours also being unexpected as well. And then as far as in relation to the women at the end, which I thought was interesting, I think it's important for us to think, how can we be ministering to God? And I think one of the ways that we do that actually is in how we minister to others, because we are part of the body of Christ, as others are as well. And so ministering to Christ is actually ministering to those in his body. So in closing, because I think it's related to what we've seen here and kind of gets to something that Mark didn't mention, was kind of the why. And I think Peter talks about that in 1 Peter. So 1 Peter 2:21-25. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Okay, let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, we thank you for this lesson. We thank you for what it shows of your son in his death. And we pray that you would be helping us to learn from this and to see more of you and to love you because of what you have done for us. We thank you for sending your son. We thank you for the sacrifice that he offered on our behalf, and that you have accepted and shown that you have accepted this by raising him from the dead. Pray that you be using this lesson in our lives and that you be helping us to think about it during this next week. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.